Scriptures. In Jesus' name, amen. We actually had part of this reading, or today's reading that we just heard from Wayne, we looked at it a few weeks ago as well, but we ended this reading in a different spot. The lawyer asks Jesus, and then who then is my neighbor? And Jesus responds by telling the story of the Good Samaritan. And we talked about that a few weeks ago back in August. We looked at the Good Samaritan story. But I wanted to look at this reading again, and just this first part of it, because there's much more going on here than just the Good Samaritan story and this idea of who is my neighbor. And it's funny that actually we do a lot of talking in the church about God loving us. We get assured of that each week, and we do need a lot of talk about that. We need reminding of that. We also talk a lot about us loving others, right? So love your neighbor as yourself, and then you ask, who is my neighbor? And then we try to live that out in our lives. Like, how do we best do that? And we need a lot of that too. But somehow, the core command of the Hebrew Scriptures is actually not about God loving us. God is obviously not commanding himself to love us. And the loving your neighbor is actually an add-on to the core command. The core command is actually what gets quoted here in this reading from Luke is actually from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. And it's this. Lots of us will know this. The core command of the Hebrew Scriptures is love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. And it's funny to me that we don't always talk a lot about us loving God. It's sort of an assumed baseline. I don't know if you noticed this discrepancy between the reading we heard from Luke and what I just quoted from Deuteronomy, but just listen to the Deuteronomy one again. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. What's missing? Or what gets added, I guess, is a better one. What gets added in Luke? Mind. Mind gets added. So the original did not have mind. And I remember years and years ago, a member of the church talking to me about how he believed everything in his head. He could believe everything in his head. He intellectually had thought about it. But he said, for some reason, it's all here, but it's not here. I don't feel it in my heart. And he kind of wanted to. He wanted to, but he didn't. And some of the ways others in the church were talking at that time, the way they were talking about their relationship with God actually made him feel that his faith was somehow deficient, that it needed to go from here to here. And I assured him that his faith was not deficient at all, and it was perfectly fine to primarily engage his faith intellectually, and was actually standing in a good tradition of Presbyterians that come at the matter of faith through the intellect and are, in fact, fairly suspect of things like feelings in our heart. I'm reminded of Dr. Ross Lockhart, who's the Dean of St. Andrew's Hall in Vancouver, and he's preached here a couple of times at Prairie, including via video during the pandemic. And I've heard him say numerous times on occasions when the subject of feeling our faith comes up, he says, I had an emotion 20 years ago. I didn't like it. Some people will tell you that the Hebrew idea of love, like in the Hebrew Scriptures, the idea of love is actually not about feelings at all. It's action-oriented. So love and devotion is always just evident in how you act. It's a choice. And I've been told this numerous times, but in a lot of ways, I was thinking about it this week, and that actually doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And when you really look at how the word love is used, not just in the Bible, but everywhere, the core concept is, of course, not at all about actions, is it? It seems to be about feelings, but actually that's not quite right either. It's more that the fundamental basis when we talk about love is simply about relationships. So, yes, our actions will reflect it, but our actions are always about how we're treating another person, right? Our feelings might be about love. We might have feelings of love, but they're meaningless without the relationship that we have with the other person. The fundamental basis is about the relationship. And this commandment that is given is in the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy has this overall context. It's actually addressing a particular people, and it continues to call them stiff-necked, is the word that is used of this people. And essentially, Deuteronomy spells out that the people have been rebellious against God, and a bunch of that rebellion has actually been a little bit inadvertent. It's not really their fault in a sense. Some of it is, but a lot of it has just sort of been, they've slipped into a different life than the life God intended for them. They are loving the wrong God. The context of Deuteronomy actually gives us this feeling that the people's love that they have, which they do love, it's actually misdirected. They've been loving the wrong things. They've been loving other things rather than loving God. And we know this. We're supposed to put God first. Don't allow other things to occupy the space of love that is reserved for God alone. But we don't only love God, do we? And we're not supposed to only love God. We're supposed to love our spouses and our partners and our children, our family and our parents and our friends and our neighbors, and according to Jesus, even our enemies. So what does it mean to love God and all of these as well? Because there is a particular place reserved for God and our love for God. And that place reserved for God is a love that we have for God as God. Nothing else and no one else can take that place or should. And yet often we live our lives like the people that Deuteronomy are addressing in such a way that we actually have put something else in the place of God. That might be ourselves, it might even be our children, it might be money, it might be our jobs. We put all kinds of other things, not just ahead of God, but sometimes even in place of God. And we pursue those things rather than really loving God. So what we end up with is that if we want to love God as God alone, it actually means ruthlessly examining all that we have elevated to the status of God in our lives, actually doing that self-examination, looking at that, and then what the Bible calls repenting. And in Hebrew, that word means to turn. It's very bodily and action-oriented. Like, you're doing these things, and you're ignoring God. You're going to turn away from those and turn toward God. And that might even include good things that you're doing, but you've just elevated them from good to ultimate, right? So you're going to turn back to God. It's a good way of thinking about it. Interestingly, in Greek, maybe this is partly why in Luke we get included the mind. The word repent actually means change of mind. So one way of thinking is the Hebrew thinking is actually change of heart. It's like Hebrew's heart is like the guts. It's like, oh, we can feel it. We're going to do something. And Greek is often in the head. And so there's this change of mind. So we actually need to change our minds about how we are thinking about things. I'm pursuing wealth. I'm pursuing my job, and I'm going to examine that and realize, oh, I need to change my mind. I actually need to think differently. I need to be focused on God here. So whether it's change of mind or change of heart or turning, that's what we're called to do. And so we do this self-examination. And then we can be called back to love God as God in our life. And this is partly why we have a prayer of confession in every single worship service we do. This is important to Presbyterians, actually, is to acknowledge that we're not getting this right. We're getting it wrong. We need to actually turn. There are things that we've put before God, and we're going to confess that we've done that. Confession is actually a core practice. And it's one of those practices we're going to continue to come back to as a congregation, and we need to come back to as people. But what's interesting is that there's something far more central than confession or doing this self-examination. There's something that actually pre-exists confession, and it actually extends beyond it as well. So something we need to have before confessing and before self-examination. Once we've done that self-examination, this will also extend past it. It's encompassing it. And we're going to come to this, but I want to point to this idea of loving God and how the context for that is relationship. And we find this even just in the imagery that's used to talk about God's relationship with us in the Bible. So the two most common images for God in the Bible in terms of relational images between us and God are parent and child, right? And the second one is to talk about that relationship as a marriage. So those are the two most common ones in the scripture. There's other images as well, but those are the big ones. It talks about parent-child imagery and then marriage imagery. Particularly in the prophets, they use marriage imagery and talk about the covenant that God's people have with God as a marriage, as a marriage covenant. And so I want you to think for a minute about that, say, practice of confession, which we might be familiar with because we're pretty familiar with how we mess up. We're pretty familiar with that. And we're familiar with the need for forgiving one another. Or we're familiar with, I'm not very good at that and I'm good at holding grudges. Like we're actually really good at understanding the brokenness of relationships. But I want you to imagine that what if the core practice in, say, a parent-child relationship or a marriage was actually confession? What if that was the core basis for the relationship? See, the fundamental assumption here would then be that the relationship starts off broken and it's continually broken. And imagine how ridiculous it would be to start off in a romantic relationship with the assumption that this thing is broken. Like, that's ridiculous. We would never do that. I'm pretty sure that that relationship would go absolutely nowhere. And of course, as the relationship grows, you're going to have to learn how to say sorry because things are going to go wrong. And you're going to have to learn how to forgive. And then your love is what is going to see you through that practice of confessing. But the first thing to do is not self-examination and confession in that relationship, is it? The first thing, or the thing that starts to grow in that kind of relationship, and indeed the thing that we want more than anything when a relationship is starting, whether it's with parent or child or a romantic relationship, the first thing we do is abide. That's what we really want. We want to be with the other person. We want to live with each other. I don't mean like moving in together. I mean, we want to be in each other's lives. Like we want to live together. Our challenge is that a feeling of the love of God is not a given in the same way that it is a given with parent-child or in romantic relationships, right? So most parents will tell you their overwhelming feelings of love for their children and how that seemed to just happen when they were born, or maybe even when they first discovered that there was a pregnancy that might even happen. This overwhelming feeling of love for their child. And romantic love also seems to just sort of happen to us. Yes, it can grow, it can come from somewhere, but it just sort of seems to happen. These things just happen, and the happening just doesn't seem to be there in the same way with God. Certainly it is for some people, but I think for the majority of people, that doesn't really we're not just walking around and suddenly we think, oh, I really love God so much. It doesn't just hit us in the same way the others do. And so what we actually need is a practice that gets us toward growing a love for God. And abiding is actually the key. It's the same as in other relationships. Think about friendships, actually, because these might be a little closer in a way to how we might interact with God. Friendships, think about what friends do. You know, some friends, they like to go out and get coffee together, and so they meet at the coffee shop and they talk away over coffees. And I saw some people, especially during the pandemic, bringing lawn chairs to Tim Hortons parking lots and sitting with their friends in the parking lot of Tim Hortons. Let's get together and have our coffee out in the parking lot because we're not able to go inside. Some friends play sports together or watch sports together. Some friends play board games together. I'm kind of naming all the things I like to do with my friends right now. And in these settings, right, or other kinds of settings, there's always like a back and forth that happens, right? There's a conversation. There's speaking and listening on both sides. And ultimately, what are the friends actually doing? They're hanging out with each other. That's what friends do. And that's the practice of abiding. They're abiding with each other. That's like the churchy or biblical word to talk about it. Abiding together. And you'll notice that there isn't really an agenda other than being friends. There might be a venue, right? But the agenda isn't, it isn't actually about watching the sporting event. It isn't about whether the coffee's good or not, or even if everyone's drinking the coffee. It's just the agenda is being friends. The agenda is the relationship itself. And we have to ask ourselves, if we're commanded to love God, when do we spend time with God without agenda? Because often our time with God, if we have any, it's usually spent in ways that have an agenda. And I want you to notice that actually all these things are actually good things. It's totally fine to go to God and have an agenda. I'm just saying you can't only do that. There needs to be a basis for the relationship with God. These are all good things. But the relationship cannot be ultimately built only through these things that I'm going to share with you, because I want you to imagine, what if our friendships were like this? Okay, so I go to church to learn something, or I go to a Bible study to learn something, or I read my Bible because I'm going to learn something about the Bible or about God, and I'm trying to figure out how do I apply it to my life so it needs to be useful. Imagine if we approached friendship like that. I need friends that I can learn something from so that they can be useful to me. That seems, there's something off about that. Or I'm going to ask God for help. I need there's healing for somebody, help with passing an exam. I don't have a job right now and I need help to find a job, or whatever it is, or the world situation. But again, imagine if all we did with our friends was constantly say to them, have you found me a job yet? That's not a basis for a friendship. Or we'll go to God and we'll say, I confess. I'm going to say I'm sorry. I feel bad, so I'm going to confess to God. Certainly we need to do that with our friends, especially if we've hurt them. We need to confess. But imagine if every single time you saw that friend, you're like, I got another thing to tell you that I'm really sorry about. What's going to happen for the friendship? That's not the basis for the friendship. So we do this with God in our time of prayer. We have an agenda. These are agendas that we bring to God, and they're not bad things. We should do all of them in their proper order and proper place. The point is, we have an agenda most of the time when we come to God. So can we be agendaless? Can we be without an agenda? We actually need a practice to help us do this, to help us simply be with God, to hang out, to abide. And we're going to need to intentionally choose to do it. If we're going to grow in loving God and having our lives transformed by our relationship with God, we need a way to intentionally be in God's presence. And you can say, well, God's present everywhere, so I'm always in God's presence. No. That's kind of like saying, well, I know where my friend lives. I know they're there. This needs to be one of our basic building blocks for our spiritual life. This is one of the first things we need, just being with God, because other spiritual practices actually get off kilter when we are not actually in a proper relationship with God. If we're not abiding, the other things we're going to do are going to get sidetracked or go off in not a great direction. So if we don't start with abiding and then growing in our love for God as God has perfectly loved us, then, when we do other things, like if we only did confession, what would end up happening is it would teach us over time that our relationship with God is primarily about guilt and shame, right? If all we did was confession, we would just learn that we're just supposed to feel bad about the things we've done or the things we've left undone, because all we ever do is go to God and say sorry. It just teaches us to be guilty and shameful. But actually, that's not what the practice of confession is supposed to be at all. It's supposed to be a celebration of the grace and love of God, so we have to steep ourselves in that reality so that when we do come to confession, we are so assured of this loving embrace that God gives us. Intercession, which is the fancy word for asking for help from God. If that's all we did without this abiding in God, it would end up teaching us that our relationship with God is primarily just that we have a genie in the sky who can fix our problems, and it's really unpredictable. We don't really know when the genie is going to do something and when the genie is not, but we should ask. It'll just teach us that that's what God is there. God's a wish granter. If that's all we do, if we don't abide. And even Sabbath, which we started this series on, talking about our rest and our real need for that. If all we did was say, well, we're just going to rest on the seventh day, we're going to do that, and we actually don't also focus on our relationship with God in the midst of it, if all we do is take that break, well, we may just learn that our relationship with God is about us being too busy for God for 6 days and then likely too tired for God on the seventh. So we need to practice to simply be with God, to abide with God, to do so with no agenda, no list, nothing. And the lack of agenda is actually on both sides. We come to God and set our agenda aside, and God actually does not come to us with an agenda either. And yes, sometimes God will call us to do things. Those agendas are going to come together at other times, but we need time set aside for a practice that is actually just about the building of the relationship, just being together. Now, if this sounds maybe strange, just think again about your closest relationship. You actually don't want the majority of your encounters with the person who's closest to you. You don't want the majority of your encounters to be primarily agenda-focused. The point is the relationship, right? It doesn't mean you don't ever work on anything together. It doesn't mean you don't share with each other what's happening in your life. It doesn't mean you don't ask one another to do something for you. Of course you do all of that, but the best relationships, and even the ones where the balance of power is tilted in someone's favor, like parent-child or you and God, the best relationships are not about creating a codependency. The best relationships aren't even about give and take or compromise. We sometimes think they are. The best ones are where you can fully be yourself and the other is fully themselves as well. And that when you are together, you are just together. And so we need a practice to help us have that with this God that we are asked to love. So our practice for this week is a practice called centering prayer. And so we're going to encourage you to try this throughout the week. In a minute, Aaron's going to lead us through a short version of centering prayer, and just to give us a flavor of what that's like. And we also have on the Prairie website some resources and also just two basic formats you can use for doing centering prayer if you're not familiar with it, because it's maybe a little bit of an unfamiliar practice, but it gets at this idea of actually just being with God and not having an agenda in that prayer.